What if I told you that every addiction, every compulsive behavior that destroys your life, is actually your psyche's desperate attempt to heal something much deeper? Carl Jung, the revolutionary psychiatrist who transformed our understanding of the human mind, discovered a shocking truth about addiction that the medical establishment still struggles to accept today. Jung believed that behind every addiction lies what he called the God-sized hole in the soul, a profound spiritual and psychological emptiness that we try to fill with substances, behaviors, or relationships. But here's the revolutionary part. He argued that you cannot heal any addiction until you face the one inner truth that your addiction is protecting you from confronting. This isn't about willpower. It's not about moral failure or character defects. According to Jung, addiction is the psyche's misguided attempt to solve a problem it doesn't have the tools to address consciously. Your addiction is actually trying to heal you, but it's using the wrong medicine. If you're ready to understand addiction through the profound lens of Jungian psychology and discover why traditional approaches often fail women especially, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're exploring the depths of the feminine psyche and the hidden wisdom that can transform not just addiction, but your entire relationship with yourself. Jung's perspective on addiction was revolutionary because he understood something that medical professionals are only beginning to grasp. Addiction is not a disease to be cured, but a symptom of a much deeper psychological and spiritual crisis. He believed that what we call addiction is actually the shadow side of our spiritual longing, our soul's desperate attempt to transcend the limitations of ordinary consciousness. Consider Lisa, a successful marketing executive who struggled with alcohol for 15 years. Every night, she would come home and drink wine until the constant anxiety in her chest finally quieted. Traditional therapy told her she had a drinking problem. Jung would have said she had a spiritual problem that was expressing itself through alcohol. The wine wasn't the real issue. It was her psyche's clumsy attempt to access what he called the transcendent function, the bridge between conscious and unconscious that allows for genuine transformation. Jung observed that women, in particular, often develop addictions as a way of coping with what he called the unlived life, the parts of themselves they've had to suppress or deny in order to fit into a world that hasn't traditionally valued feminine ways of knowing and being. Your addiction might be your soul's rebellion against a life that feels too small for who you really are. The inner truth that Jung believed we must face isn't comfortable. It requires us to acknowledge that our addiction isn't happening to us. It's happening for us as a message from our unconscious about what needs to be healed, integrated, or expressed in our lives. Jung discovered that every addiction serves as what he called a shadow projection, a way of avoiding the parts of ourselves we find too painful or frightening to face directly. The substance or behavior becomes a container for all the emotions, desires, and aspects of personality that we've rejected or been taught to suppress. For women, this shadow material often includes what Jung called the negative animus, the wounded masculine energy within the feminine psyche. This might manifest as suppressed anger, denied ambition, or the parts of yourself that want to create, compete, or claim space in the world. When these aspects remain unconscious, they can drive addictive behaviors as a way of expressing what can't be acknowledged directly. Take Rachel, a mother of 3 who developed a shopping addiction that nearly bankrupted her family. On the surface, it seemed like simple materialism or lack of self-control. But Jung would have recognized something deeper. Rachel's unconscious rebellion against a life where she had completely erased herself in service to others. The shopping wasn't about acquiring things. It was her shadow's attempt to reclaim some sense of personal identity and worth. Jung understood that addiction often emerges when we've split ourselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts. The acceptable part is the persona we show the world, the good mother, the dutiful daughter, the successful professional. But the unacceptable part, what he called the shadow, contains our authentic desires, our creative impulses, our anger, our sexuality, our power. When the shadow remains unconscious, it doesn't disappear. It goes underground and starts running the show from behind the scenes. Addiction becomes the shadow's way of getting what it needs, even if it's through destructive means. The woman who's never allowed herself to feel angry might become addicted to rage-inducing social media drama. The one who suppressed her sexuality might develop compulsive romantic behaviors. Jung believed that the healing of addiction requires what he called shadow integration, the conscious recognition and acceptance of these rejected parts of ourselves. This isn't about acting out every impulse, but about acknowledging that these aspects exist and finding healthy ways to honor them. The inner truth that addiction protects us from facing is often this: I have needs, desires, and aspects of myself that I've been taught are unacceptable, but they're actually essential parts of who I am. For many women, this includes the need for creative expression, personal autonomy, or the right to take up space without justifying their existence. Jung observed that addiction serves as a kind of false individuation, a counterfeit version of the psychological wholeness we're actually seeking. The temporary relief or altered state that substances provide mimics the genuine transcendence that comes from integrating our shadow material and becoming whole. The tragedy is that addiction promises what Jung called participation mystique, a temporary fusion with something larger than ourselves, but it delivers isolation and fragmentation instead. True healing requires recognizing that what you're seeking through your addiction is actually available through the conscious integration of your rejected self. Perhaps Jung's most profound insight about addiction was his recognition that it represents what he called a low-level search for God, the soul's misdirected attempt to experience the sacred in a world that has become spiritually barren. He famously wrote to Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, that alcoholism was the equivalent of spiritual thirst, and that the only cure was a genuine spiritual experience. Jung understood that human beings have an innate need for transcendence, for connection to something greater than their individual ego. When this spiritual dimension is missing from life, the psyche will seek it through whatever means available, often through substances or behaviors that temporarily alter consciousness and provide a taste of the transcendent experience we're craving. For women especially, this spiritual thirst often stems from what Jung called the wounded feminine, the collective trauma of centuries of having our intuitive wisdom, our connection to nature's cycles, and our role as carriers of sacred knowledge devalued or suppressed. Many women develop addictions because they're unconsciously trying to reconnect with this lost spiritual heritage. Consider Maria, a successful attorney who struggled with prescription pill addiction for years. On the surface, it seemed like stress management gone wrong. But Jung would have recognized that Maria was unconsciously trying to access what he called the archetypal feminine, the deep, intuitive knowing that had been educated out of her through years of rational, linear thinking required by her profession. The pills temporarily quieted the mental chatter and allowed her to feel connected to something beyond her analytical mind. Jung believed that modern society, with its emphasis on materialism and rational thinking, has created what he called the spiritual desert, a cultural environment where the soul's need for meaning, mystery, and transcendence goes unmet. Women, as natural carriers of what he termed the religious function, feel this spiritual poverty especially acutely. The inner truth that many women must face is this: their addiction is their soul's desperate attempt to find the sacred in a world that has forgotten how to honor the feminine mysteries. The altered states that substances provide mimic what Jung called the numinous experience, encounters with the divine that naturally occur when we connect with our deepest self through meditation, creative expression, or communion with nature. Jung observed that addiction often serves as what he called a substitute religion. A ritualistic practice that provides structure, community, and altered consciousness in place of genuine spiritual connection. The problem is that this substitute religion ultimately leads to destruction rather than transcendence. He believed that true healing from addiction required what he called the religious attitude, not adherence to any particular doctrine, but a reverent openness to the mystery of existence and our place within the larger cosmic order. For women, this often means reclaiming their natural role as priestesses of their own inner wisdom. The spiritual dimension of addiction healing isn't about finding God in the traditional sense. It's about recognizing that the divine feminine principle exists within you and learning to access it through conscious practice, rather than through substances that ultimately disconnect you from your authentic spiritual nature. Jung would say that your addiction is actually your soul's way of telling you that you're spiritually starving, and that no amount of external substances can fill the God-sized hole that can only be healed through genuine connection to your inner sacred self. Now we come to the heart of Jung's revolutionary understanding of addiction, the specific inner truth that your psyche is desperately trying to protect you from confronting. This truth is so threatening to your current identity, so seemingly impossible to bear, that your unconscious mind would rather risk destroying your life through addiction than face it directly. The devastating inner truth is this: you are living a life that is fundamentally untrue to who you really are. Your addiction exists because some essential part of your authentic self has been so thoroughly rejected, suppressed, or abandoned that it can only express itself through destructive, compulsive behaviors. Jung called this the unlived life, the parts of ourselves that we've sacrificed in order to be acceptable, lovable, or successful according to external standards. For women, this unlived life often includes our creative power, our sexual sovereignty, our right to anger, our need for solitude, or our deep connection to the natural world and its cycles. Take Catherine, a devoted mother and wife who developed a severe eating disorder in her 40s. Everyone saw her as the perfect woman, selfless, nurturing, always putting others first. But Jung would have recognized that Catherine's relationship with food was her psyche's way of expressing the rage and control that had been completely banished from her conscious personality. The eating disorder was the only way her unlived life, the part that wanted to say no, to have needs, to take up space, could make itself known. The inner truth that Catherine had to face was terrifying. She had spent decades being who others needed her to be, while completely abandoning who she actually was. Her addiction was her soul's rebellion against this self-betrayal, but it was happening in the only way her unconscious mind felt was safe, through a behavior that seemed to make her smaller and more acceptable rather than larger and more threatening. Jung understood that this inner truth feels literally life-threatening because it challenges the very foundation of how we've constructed our identity and our relationships. If you're the good girl who never causes problems, facing your authentic anger feels like it will destroy everything you've built. If you're the strong one who takes care of everyone, acknowledging your need to be cared for feels like it will leave you abandoned and alone. But here's what Jung discovered. Your addiction will continue to escalate until you face this truth, because your psyche will keep turning up the volume on the distress signal. The part of you that's been abandoned isn't going away. It's getting louder and more destructive in its attempts to get your attention. The most devastating aspect of this inner truth is recognizing how much of your life has been built on a false foundation. You might have to acknowledge that the career you've pursued isn't actually what you wanted, that the relationships you've maintained require you to betray yourself, or that the persona you've perfected is suffocating your authentic nature. For many women, this truth involves recognizing that they've been living according to what Jung called the collective shadow, societal expectations about femininity that require them to be perpetually giving, accommodating, and self-sacrificing, while denying their own needs, desires, an individual path. The inner truth your addiction protects you from is ultimately this: you deserve to live as your authentic self, even if that threatens every relationship and structure you've built around your false identity. Once you've faced the devastating truth that your addiction is protecting you from your unlived life, Jung believed that genuine healing could begin. But this isn't the kind of healing that simply removes symptoms. It's what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you've been conditioned to be. Jung's approach to addiction healing was radically different from conventional methods because he understood that you can't heal addiction by fighting it directly. Instead, you heal it by giving your unlived life conscious expression. When the authentic parts of yourself find healthy ways to be seen and honored, the addiction naturally loses its power because it's no longer needed as a distress signal. This process requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between who you've been and who you're becoming without collapsing back into old patterns. For women, this often means learning to honor both their need for connection and their need for individuality, both their nurturing nature and their fierce independence. Consider Diana, a nurse who had struggled with alcohol addiction for years. Traditional recovery programs told her to avoid triggers and white-knuckle her way through cravings. But when Diana began exploring her unlived life through Jungian therapy, she discovered that her drinking was connected to her suppressed artistic nature. She had always been a painter, but had abandoned art to pursue a practical career in nursing. As Diana began painting again, something miraculous happened. Her desire to drink simply evaporated. She wasn't fighting the addiction anymore. She was feeding the part of herself that the addiction had been trying to nourish. The alcohol had been a poor substitute for the transcendent experience she found when creating art. Jung believed that this kind of healing requires what he called active imagination, consciously dialoguing with the parts of yourself that have been driving the addictive behavior. Instead of seeing your addiction as an enemy to be defeated, you begin to understand it as a misguided ally trying to help you access something you need. If you're ready to explore your own unlived life and discover what your addiction might be trying to tell you, make sure to subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. We're building a community of women who are brave enough to face their authentic selves and transform their lives from the inside out. The path Jung outlined isn't easy, but it's profoundly liberating. It requires you to grieve the life you've been living while simultaneously embracing the life that wants to emerge. This process often involves what he called the dark night of the soul, a period where your old identity has died, but your new one hasn't fully emerged yet. For women especially, this transformation often means reclaiming what Jung called the wise woman archetype, the part of the feminine psyche that knows its own worth, trusts its own instincts, and refuses to betray itself for the comfort of others. This isn't about becoming selfish. It's about becoming authentic. Jung understood that true healing from addiction creates what he called the wounded healer, someone whose own journey through darkness gives them the wisdom and compassion to guide others home to themselves. Your addiction isn't a character flaw to be ashamed of. It's actually preparing you to become a carrier of consciousness for other women who are struggling with their own unlived lives. Jung's final insight about addiction was perhaps his most radical. He believed that healing doesn't happen when you stop the addictive behavior, but when you make the conscious choice to live authentically, regardless of the consequences. This choice is what he called the heroic act, the decision to honor your true nature even when it threatens everything you've built around your false self. This choice is particularly revolutionary for women because it requires us to abandon what Jung called the collective expectations of femininity, the unconscious agreement to be perpetually accommodating, self-sacrificing, and focused on others' needs rather than our own. Making this choice means risking disapproval, abandonment, and the loss of relationships that were built on your willingness to betray yourself. But Jung discovered something extraordinary. When you make this choice authentically, the people who truly love you will adapt and grow with you, while those who only loved your false persona will naturally fall away. This isn't a loss. It's a clearing that makes space for relationships based on truth rather than performance. The woman who recovers from addiction through Jung's approach doesn't just stop using substances. She becomes a completely different person. She trusts her instincts, honors her needs, expresses her creativity, and refuses to participate in relationships or situations that require her to abandon herself. This transformation is so profound that Jung called it psychological rebirth. Remember Lisa from the beginning of our journey. When she finally faced the truth that her drinking was masking her soul's rebellion against a life that felt too small, she didn't just quit alcohol. She quit her job, ended her marriage to a man who couldn't see her authentic self, and started the creative business she'd been dreaming about for years. Her life became unrecognizable, but for the first time, it was actually hers. Jung understood that this kind of transformation is what addiction has been trying to accomplish all along: the death of the false self and the birth of the authentic one. Addiction is actually your psyche's crude but determined attempt at individuation. When you understand this, you can cooperate with the process consciously instead of letting it destroy your life unconsciously. The revolutionary choice isn't just about your personal healing. It's about contributing to what Jung called the collective healing of the feminine. Every woman who chooses authenticity over acceptability makes it easier for the next woman to make the same choice. You become part of a lineage of women who refuse to live unlived lives. Your addiction was never your enemy. It was your soul's desperate attempt to wake you up to the life you were meant to live. The question isn't whether you can stop your addictive behavior. It's whether you're brave enough to start living as who you really are. Jung believed that when you make this choice, you don't just heal your addiction. You become a healing presence in the world. Your authenticity becomes a gift to everyone whose life you touch, permission for them to be real in a world that rewards pretense. The inner truth you've been avoiding isn't going to destroy you. It's going to set you free. And in your freedom, you become a beacon for every other woman who is ready to stop living someone else's life and start living her own.